The crystal wine glass slipped from my trembling fingers, shattering against the marble floor of Marcus's penthouse kitchen. Red wine spread across the pristine white stone like blood, but I barely noticed. My eyes were fixed on the platinum wedding band, glinting in the morning sunlight, streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. Not just any wedding band, an engraved wedding band that read, "Marcus and Victoria, forever begins today with yesterday's date." Yesterday, while I was teaching my third-grade class at Lincoln Elementary, believing my boyfriend of 5 years was in Seattle closing a major real estate deal, he was actually exchanging vows with someone named Victoria in what looked like the most expensive wedding Chicago had ever seen. My name is Jessica Rivera, and until 30 seconds ago, I thought I knew exactly who I was and where my life was heading. I'm 28 years old, a dedicated elementary school teacher who spent her weekends helping Marcus organize his real estate empire files, cooking elaborate dinners in this very kitchen, and planning the future I thought we were building together. The band sat on the kitchen counter next to a stack of professional wedding photos still in their pristine white envelope. Photos of Marcus, my Marcus, in a charcoal gray tuxedo, beaming as he kissed a stunning blonde woman in a designer gown that probably cost more than my annual salary. The sound of the penthouse elevator chiming made my heart stop. Marcus was home from his honeymoon. I could hear his voice echoing through the foyer, speaking to someone on his phone in that confident tone I'd fallen in love with 5 years ago when he'd walked into my classroom during career day. Back then, he'd seemed like a miracle. Successful, charming, interested in a small-town teacher who'd moved to Chicago with nothing but hope and a stack of student loans. No Mother Victoria understands the prenup completely. His voice grew closer. The Ashford family has their own money. This merger makes perfect sense for both our portfolios. Merger. He was talking about his marriage like a business transaction. I grabbed the wedding photos, my hands shaking, as I flipped through image after image of Marcus's perfect day. Him laughing with groomsmen I'd never met. Victoria posing with bridesmaids in silk dresses that matched her sapphire engagement ring, a ring I'd never seen despite organizing his jewelry collection monthly. There were photos of him dancing with an elegant older woman who had to be Victoria's mother, cutting a 5-tier cake, toasting with champagne that probably cost more than my monthly rent. In every single image, he looked happier than I'd ever seen him. The elevator doors opened and Marcus walked into his penthouse, still on his phone, dragging a Louis Vuitton suitcase behind him. He was tan relaxed, wearing the casual linen shirt I'd bought him for Christmas, the one he'd claimed was too expensive for everyday wear. When he saw me standing in his kitchen, surrounded by broken glass and wedding photos, his face went through a series of expressions I'd never seen before. Surprise, calculation, and finally, a cold mask I didn't recognize. "I'll call you back," he said into his phone, never taking his eyes off me. For a moment, we just stared at each other across the kitchen that had been our shared space for 3 years. The kitchen, where I'd made him coffee every morning, where we'd planned weekend trips that never seemed to happen, where he'd promised me last month that we'd talk about marriage soon. "Marcus," I whispered, holding up the wedding band. "What is this?" Before he could answer, my phone buzzed with a text from my best friend, Carmen. "Jess, you need to call me right now. I just saw something on Chicago Social's Instagram that you need to see." But I was already seeing it. I was living it. Marcus set down his suitcase with deliberate care, buying himself time to think. When he looked at me again, the man I'd loved for 5 years was gone, replaced by someone who looked at me like I was trespassing in his life. "How did you find those?" he asked, his voice eerily calm. "They were on your counter," I managed to say. "I was cleaning like I always do, like the good little girlfriend I've been for 5 years, while you were apparently planning a completely different life." The photos slipped from my numb fingers, scattering across the broken glass, like confetti from someone else's celebration. Images of Marcus's real life, his chosen life, the life that had never included me as anything more than a convenient placeholder. "Jessica," Marcus began straightening his shoulders in the way I'd always found attractive, but now seemed calculating. "You need to understand something about the real world." But I was already understanding. As I looked around this penthouse that I'd helped maintain at this man, I'd rearranged my entire existence around. At these photos, documenting a wedding I'd been completely excluded from, I finally understood exactly how little I'd ever meant to the person I'd thought was my future. The autumn wind rattled the windows 40 stories above Chicago, and somewhere in the distance, church bells were ringing. But all I could hear was the sound of my own heart breaking, and the first sparks of something that felt dangerously like rage beginning to kindle in my chest. Marcus moved to his home bar and poured himself a scotch, his movements deliberate and controlled. The golden liquid caught the afternoon light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting amber shadows across his face. "Jessica, what you need to understand," he said without looking at me, "is that some relationships serve different purposes. What we had was comfortable, convenient. But Victoria and we make sense on paper." Each word hit like a physical blow, but I forced myself to stay standing. "Comfortable. I've been living here for 3 years, Marcus. I've been planning our future." He laughed, a sound I'd never heard from him before. Cold and dismissive. "Our future, Jess, be realistic. Look around." He gestured at the penthouse, with its designer furniture and million-dollar view. "This is a $40 million property. Victoria's family owns half of the Gold Coast. You teach elementary school." I stared at him, seeing clearly, for the first time, the man I'd been sharing a bed with for 5 years. So this was all fake. Every "I love you," every plan we made. "It served its purpose," he said, finally meeting my eyes. "You kept my life, organized my home, clean. You were available when I needed companionship. But marriage building a legacy that requires someone from my world." My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from Carmen. When I didn't answer, she immediately texted, "Jess, Marcus Blackwood's wedding is all over social media. Call me." Blackwood. I'd been with him for 5 years and never knew that was his real last name. To me, he'd always been Marcus Chen, the charming real estate developer who'd swept me off my feet. But Marcus Blackwood was apparently someone else entirely. Someone with a family name that meant something in Chicago's elite circles. "Even your name was a lie," I whispered. "Chen is my middle name," he said dismissively. "I use it for certain business dealings." The pieces were clicking into place with horrifying clarity. The mysterious business trips that always seemed to happen on weekends. The way he'd never introduced me to his family or close friends. How he'd insisted I keep our relationship private because he didn't want his business competitors to target me. While I'd been living in what I thought was love, he'd been conducting his real life somewhere else entirely. "How long?" I asked. "How long have you been engaged to her?" Marcus swirled his scotch, considering his answer. 2 years. 2 years. For 2 years, while I'd been cooking his dinner and organizing his closets and believing his promises about our future, he'd been planning a wedding with someone else. "Does she know about me?" Victoria knows I had arrangements before we got serious. His tone suggested these arrangements were as disposable as paper plates. My hands were shaking so violently, I had to grip the edge of the counter. On the marble surface, the wedding photos were scattered like evidence of a crime. In one, I could see Victoria's family, old money, written in every line of their designer clothes, and confident postures. In another, Marcus was dancing with her, both of them, laughing at some private joke. They looked like they belonged together in a way that made my chest ache. "I need to go," I managed to say. "That's probably best." Marcus agreed, checking his watch. "Victoria and I are having dinner with her parents tonight. They want to discuss the foundation merger." Even now, even after destroying me, he was talking about his real life, like I was just an interruption to be managed. I walked toward the elevator on unsteady legs, passing the hall where my favorite sweater still hung in the closet, where my books sat on his shelves, where evidence of our shared life remained scattered throughout his space, like artifacts from a civilization that had never really existed. "Jessica," Marcus called out just as the elevator doors opened. I turned, hoping for something, an apology, an explanation, some sign that 5 years had meant something to him. "Make sure you take all your things," he said. "Victoria will be moving in next week." 3 days later, I sat in my cramped studio apartment, surrounded by the boxes I'd packed from Marcus's penthouse. My real apartment, the one I'd kept just in case, despite spending most nights at his place for 3 years. The lease I'd maintained because some small voice in my head had never quite trusted the fairy tale I was living. Carmen sat across from me on my secondhand couch laptop, open scrolling through an endless stream of wedding coverage that had apparently dominated Chicago's society pages all weekend. "Jess, this is insane," she said, turning the screen toward me. "Look at this guest list." The governor was there. 3 federal judges. The CEO of Ashford Industries. That's Victoria's father. This wasn't just a wedding. It was like a political summit. I stared at the photos of Marcus Blackwood, mingling with people I recognized from newspaper headlines. Chicago's power elite celebrating his marriage to one of their own. "Here's what I don't understand," Carmen continued, clicking through more images. "If he was engaged to this woman for 2 years, how did he hide it so completely? I mean, we're talking about Chicago high society. This stuff gets covered." She was right. I'd been Marcus's girlfriend for 5 years, but I'd never seen him in a single society column, never heard his name mentioned in connection with the Blackwood family, that apparently owned half of downtown Chicago. "Unless," Carmen said slowly, "he wasn't hiding his engagement from you. He was hiding you from his engagement." The words hit like a revelation. All those business trips, all those times he'd insisted I couldn't accompany him to work events because they were boring or not appropriate for someone outside the industry. All those weekend conferences that happened to coincide with what I now realized must have been wedding planning sessions. He hadn't been living a double life. He'd been living his real life and keeping me as a secret side arrangement. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Is this Jessica Rivera? I got your number from the teacher directory. We need to talk. Victoria, Ashford Blackwood." Carmen's eyes widened as I showed her the message. "His wife wants to talk to you." Before I could respond, my phone rang. Victoria Ashford Blackwood was calling me directly. I answered on the 3rd ring, my heart hammering. "Hello, Jessica." Her voice was refined, cultured, exactly what I'd expected from someone of her background. "Thank you for answering. I know this must be difficult." "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I want to meet," she said simply. "There are things about my husband that I think we both need to understand. Victoria had chosen a small cafe in Lincoln Park, far from the Gold Coast restaurants where she normally spent her time. When I arrived, I spotted her immediately. Blonde hair pulled back in a perfect chignon designer handbag that probably cost more than my car. But her hands were shaking as she lifted her coffee cup. She was even more beautiful in person than in the wedding photos, with the kind of refined elegance that came from generations of good breeding and better schools. But up close, I could see dark circles under her expertly applied makeup and a tension in her shoulders that spoke of sleepless nights. "Thank you for coming," she said as I sat down across from her. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure I would either," I admitted. "What do you want to talk about?" Victoria studied me for a long moment, as if trying to reconcile the woman sitting across from her with whatever Marcus had told her about his arrangements. "How long were you with him?" she asked finally. 5 years. She closed her eyes briefly, as if absorbing a physical blow. 5 years, while we were engaged for 2 and dating for 3 before that. The math was devastating. Marcus had been with both of us simultaneously for our entire relationships. Neither of us had been the other woman. We'd both been deceived from the beginning. "Did you know about me?" I asked. "I knew there had been someone," Victoria said carefully. "Marcus told me he'd had a relationship with a teacher, but that it had ended years ago. He said she'd been nice, but inappropriate for his social position. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. Even when acknowledging my existence to his fiancée, Marcus had diminished me to nothing more than a footnote in his romantic history." "What made you want to find me?" I asked. Victoria reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, scrolling to a series of text messages. These came from Marcus's phone yesterday. Messages he'd apparently sent to you over the past month, but they were still in his drafts folder. She turned the screen toward me, and I read messages that made my stomach drop. "Can't wait to see you tonight. V is at her mother's. The wedding is just business. You know you're the one I really love. After the honeymoon, we'll figure out how to make this work long term. Victoria will never have to know." I stared at the messages, understanding flooding through me with horrible clarity. Marcus hadn't just been using me as a placeholder until he found someone better. He'd been planning to keep me as his secret mistress even after marrying Victoria. "He was going to continue seeing you," Victoria said, her voice tight with controlled fury. "Our wedding was supposed to be the beginning of our life together, and he was already planning how to cheat on me." "I had no idea," I said, and I could hear how weak it sounded. "If I'd known about you, about the engagement." "I believe you," Victoria said quietly, "because if you'd known, you would have been at our wedding." The statement hung between us, loaded with implications that made my pulse quicken. "What do you mean?" Victoria leaned forward, her blue eyes intense. "I mean that Marcus Blackwood has built his entire life on lies and manipulation. He lied to you about his identity, his intentions, his feelings. He lied to me about his past, his relationships, his fidelity, and I'm starting to think he's lied about a lot more than just his personal life." She pulled out a manila folder and slid it across the table. "Yesterday, I started going through the financial documents Marcus gave me as part of our prenuptial agreement. Documents about his real estate holdings, his investment portfolio, his business partnerships. I opened the folder to find photocopies of bank statements, property deeds, and business contracts. The numbers were staggering. Marcus was worth far more than I'd ever imagined. Look at the dates," Victoria said, pointing to a series of property acquisitions. Every single one of these purchases happened while he was supposedly in Seattle on business. But according to his calendar, which I now have access to as his wife, He was never in Seattle during any of those dates. Where was he? That's what I'm trying to figure out, Victoria said. But I'm starting to suspect that Marcus has been running some kind of elaborate shell game with his real estate investments, moving money around hiding assets, possibly even laundering funds through fake property sales. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. The man I'd loved for 5 years wasn't just a liar and a cheat. He might be a criminal. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because, Victoria said, her voice dropping to a whisper, I think Marcus chose both of us very carefully. You're a teacher, trustworthy, naive, unlikely to ask too many questions about his business dealings. And I'm from a banking family with connections throughout Chicago's financial district. Between the two of us, he had the perfect cover for whatever he's really been doing. As she spoke, pieces of my relationship with Marcus began clicking into place in a new and terrifying way. The way he'd always insisted on keeping our finances completely separate. How he'd discouraged me from asking about his work. The expensive gifts he'd given me that I'd never quite understood how he could afford on a real estate developer's salary. He used us, I said, understanding flooding through me. He used everyone, Victoria agreed. The question is, what are we going to do about it? Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Jess, I've been thinking about our conversation. Maybe we can work something out. Can you meet me at the penthouse tonight? There are things I need to explain. Victoria saw the message and smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. Perfect timing, she said. I think it's time Marcus learned that his perfect system has developed a fatal flaw. What kind of flaw? The kind where his two victims decide to work together instead of against each other. The plan Victoria and I developed was elegant in its simplicity. I would meet Marcus at the penthouse, as he'd requested, but I wouldn't be going alone. Victoria would already be there, hidden in his study, with a recording device documenting whatever confession or admission Marcus might make when he thought he was safely manipulating me back into his web. But as I stood outside the building that had been my second home for 3 years, I felt like I was about to walk into the lair of a stranger. The doorman, James, smiled when he saw me. Ms. Rivera, good to see you. Mr. Blackwood said you'd be coming up. I wondered if James knew about the wedding, about Victoria, about any of the lies that had shaped my life for the past 5 years, or if I was just another secret in Marcus's carefully compartmentalized existence. The elevator ride to the 40th floor felt eternal. When the doors opened, I could hear Marcus moving around the penthouse, preparing for what he clearly thought would be another successful manipulation. Jessica, he called out as I entered. I'm in the kitchen. Pour yourself some wine. The casualness of it was breathtaking. 3 days ago, he'd demolished my entire understanding of our relationship, and now he was acting like we were picking up where we'd left off. I found him at the stove, cooking what looked like an elaborate dinner. He was wearing the navy blue shirt I'd given him for his birthday last year, the one he'd claimed was his favorite. The domestic scene was so familiar, so perfectly crafted, to remind me of all our quiet evenings together, that for a moment I almost forgot why I was really there. Smells good, I said, keeping my voice neutral. Your favorite, Marcus said, turning to smile at me. Osso buco with saffron risotto. I thought we should talk properly, without the shock of recent discoveries clouding our judgment. He moved toward me, reaching out as if to pull me into his arms, the way he had thousands of times before. But this time, I stepped back, and something flickered across his face. Surprise, annoyance, calculation. Marcus, what exactly did you want to talk about? He poured 2 glasses of expensive red wine, offering me one with the same charming smile that had first captivated me 5 years ago. "I want to talk about us, Jess. About our future." "What future?" I asked. "You're married." "Marriage is just a legal arrangement," Marcus said dismissively. "Victoria understands that successful men have complex needs. She's sophisticated enough to accept that my heart belongs elsewhere." The audacity of it was staggering. He was standing in his kitchen, wearing the shirt I'd given him, cooking my favorite meal, and calmly explaining how he planned to make me his permanent mistress, while his wife provided the social status and financial connections he needed. "You want me to be your side piece," I said flatly. "I want you to be my real relationship," Marcus corrected, moving closer. "Victoria is business, Jess, politics and portfolio management. But you and I, what we have is genuine." "What we have," I said, backing toward the window, "is 5 years of lies." Marcus's expression hardened slightly. "What we have is 5 years of me taking care of you, providing for you, giving you a life you never could have achieved on your own. Don't forget where you came from, Jessica. Don't forget what you were before you met me." There it was, the cruelty that had always lurked beneath his charm, the implicit message that I should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention he chose to throw my way. And what was I, Marcus, before you rescued me from my pathetic little life? You were a small-town teacher with student loans and no prospects. He said, his mask slipping completely. Living in a studio apartment, driving a car that barely ran, spending your weekends grading papers and watching Netflix alone. Each word was designed to wound, to remind me of my place in his hierarchy. But instead of feeling diminished, I felt something else entirely. A cold, clear rage that burned away the last traces of the love I'd carried for this man. "You're right," I said quietly. "I was all of those things. But I was also honest. I was real. I was someone who loved you completely and would have given you everything." "And you still can," Marcus said, reaching for me again. "Nothing has to change, Jess. We can continue exactly as we were. Except now I know the truth." "Oh, the truth," Marcus said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge, "is that you don't have many options here, Jessica. You've been living in my apartment, benefiting from my financial support, enjoying a lifestyle far above your natural station. If you try to make trouble for me, who do you think people will believe? The successful businessman with impeccable references, or the bitter ex-girlfriend with an axe to grind?" The threat was unmistakable, and for a moment I felt the old familiar fear, the terror of being alone, abandoned, left with nothing. But then I remembered Victoria sitting in the study recording every word. I remembered the financial documents that suggested Marcus's wealth might not be as legitimate as it appeared. "You're probably right," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. "Who would believe me? After all, I'm just a teacher." Marcus smiled, thinking he'd won. "Exactly. So let's be smart about this, Jess. Let's find a way to make this work for both of us." "What did you have in mind?" "I'll set you up in a nice apartment downtown," Marcus said, moving back to the stove as if the negotiation was already concluded. "Something discreet but comfortable. I'll cover all your expenses, maybe even help you get out of that elementary school and into something more suitable for a woman in your position." "My position as your mistress." "Your position as the woman I love," Marcus corrected, but his tone suggested the distinction was meaningless to him. I watched him add seasoning to the risotto, his movements confident and controlled. This was how he'd always operated, managing people like assets, manipulating emotions like market forces, arranging lives like pieces on a chessboard. "What about Victoria?" I asked. "How does she feel about this arrangement?" "Victoria understands the reality of marriage in our circles," Marcus said without looking up. She gets the social status, the family connections, the financial security. In return, she provides the same for me, plus the political access her family name brings. It's a business partnership that benefits everyone involved. And if she doesn't understand, if she wants a real marriage, Marcus's laugh was cold. Victoria Ashford didn't marry me for love, Jess. She married me because our union made sense for both our portfolios. She's smart enough not to let sentiment interfere with good business. You seem very confident about that. I am, Marcus said, finally turning to face me. Because I know how to read people, Jessica. I know what they want, what they fear, what they'll accept. It's what's made me successful in business and in life. Is that what you did with me? Read me. From the first day I walked into your classroom, Marcus admitted, with a satisfied smile. Sweet, naive teacher from a small town, desperate for someone to rescue her from her ordinary life. You were exactly what I needed. Someone who would be grateful enough not to ask too many questions. The casual admission of his manipulation should have devastated me. Instead, it was liberating. Every doubt I'd carried about my own worth, every time I'd wondered if I was being too needy or demanding, every moment I'd questioned my own perceptions. It had all been part of his calculated strategy. You know what's funny, Marcus? I said, moving toward the kitchen island where he'd left his phone charging. You're right about being good at reading people. But sometimes, even the best players make critical errors. What kind of errors? I picked up his phone, noting that he'd never changed the passcode. Our anniversary date, which now seemed like another layer of cruel irony. The kind where you assume everyone else is playing by the same rules you are. Marcus frowned, sensing that something had shifted in our conversation. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that while you were busy manipulating me, you completely missed the possibility that someone else might be manipulating you. Before he could respond, Victoria stepped out of the study, her phone in her hand, clearly having recorded our entire conversation. Hello, darling, she said to Marcus, her voice dripping with false sweetness. I hope you don't mind that I let myself in. After all, this is my home now, too. The color drained from Marcus's face as he realized the trap he'd walked into. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely afraid, his usual confident mask cracking, to reveal something desperate underneath. Is Victoria? He stammered, reaching for an explanation that would somehow make this situation manageable. This isn't what it looks like. Really? Victoria moved further into the kitchen, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown. Because it looks like my husband of exactly 6 days was just proposing to make his ex-girlfriend his permanent mistress, while explaining how our marriage is nothing more than a business transaction. She held up her phone, the recording app still running. I have everything, Marcus. Your charming explanation of how you've been manipulating Jessica for 5 years. Your detailed description of how you view our marriage as a portfolio merger. Your threats about destroying her reputation if she didn't comply with your arrangement. Marcus's eyes darted between us, his mind clearly racing to find some angle, some leverage he could use to regain control of the situation. You're taking this out of context. You know how marriage works in our circles, Victoria. You know this is standard. Standard in time. Victoria's laugh was sharp as glass. Marcus, my parents have been married for 32 years. My grandparents were married for 57. We may be wealthy, but we're not sociopaths. I watched this exchange with a mixture of satisfaction and amazement. This was a side of Victoria I hadn't expected. Fierce, intelligent, absolutely unwilling to be manipulated by a man who'd built his entire life around manipulation. Besides, Victoria continued, your little confession about reading people in arranging lives has helped me understand some other interesting inconsistencies in your financial records. Marcus went very still. What are you talking about? Victoria pulled out the manila folder from our earlier meeting and spread several documents across the kitchen island. I'm talking about the fact that you've been systematically defrauding your business partners for the past 3 years. Moving money through shell companies, selling properties that don't exist, using Jessica's name and social security number for fraudulent loan applications. The last revelation hit me like a physical blow. What? Oh, yes, Victoria said, looking at me with sympathy. You didn't know, did you? Marcus has been using your identity to secure funding for properties that exist only on paper. You're listed as a co-signer on approximately $2.3 million in fraudulent loans. I sank onto one of Marcus's expensive bar stools, the full scope of his betrayal washing over me. Not only had he stolen 5 years of my life, but he'd been setting me up to take the fall for his criminal activities. If his scheme had collapsed, I would have been the one facing charges, while he disappeared into his legitimate wealth. You're lying, Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. Am I? Victoria pulled out her own phone and dialed a number. Detective Rodriguez, this is Victoria Ashford Blackwood. I'd like to report a case of identity theft and financial fraud. Yes, I have documentation and recorded confessions. How soon can you be here? Marcus lunged forward, trying to grab Victoria's phone, but she stepped smoothly out of his reach. Don't make this worse than it already is, darling. You can't do this, Marcus said, desperation creeping into his voice. Victoria, think about what this means for your family, for your reputation. The scandal will destroy both of us. The scandal will destroy a criminal, Victoria corrected. I'll recover. The Ashford name has survived worse than a fraudulent marriage. As if summoned by her words, the elevator chimed, and 3 Chicago police detectives entered the penthouse. Marcus's perfectly controlled world was officially collapsing around him. Mr. Blackwood, the lead detective, a woman in her 40s with steel gray hair and no-nonsense demeanor, approached with handcuffs already visible. You're under arrest for wire fraud, identity theft, and money laundering. As they read Marcus his rights, I found myself thinking about the woman I'd been just a week ago. Desperate for his approval, willing to accept whatever scraps of attention he offered, convinced that my worth was tied to his choice to keep me in his life. That woman felt like a stranger now. Jessica, Victoria said quietly, as the police led Marcus away, I need you to know that I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure you're not held responsible for any of the financial fraud. I have excellent lawyers, and they'll help you navigate this. Why? I asked. Why would you help me? Because, Victoria said, watching through the window as Marcus was loaded into a police car 40 stories below. Women like us need to stick together. Men like Marcus depend on us being too ashamed or afraid to compare notes. 3 months later, I stood in front of my new 3rd grade class at a progressive private school in Lincoln Park. Victoria had been true to her word. Her legal team had not only cleared me of any connection to Marcus's crimes, but had also secured me a settlement from the fraudulent use of my identity that allowed me to pay off my student loans and start fresh. Marcus was awaiting trial, facing up to 20 years in federal prison. The investigation had uncovered a web of financial crimes that went back nearly a decade, involving dozens of victims and millions of dollars in fraudulent transactions. The scandal had indeed been massive, dominating Chicago's social pages for weeks. But Victoria had navigated it with grace and intelligence, emerging not as a victim, but as a woman who'd refused to be deceived. She'd divorced Marcus within a month of his arrest and had since become something of an advocate for financial fraud victims. We'd become unlikely friends, bonded by our shared experience of Marcus's manipulation, but discovering we genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Victoria was funnier than I'd expected, sharper, more down-to-earth, despite her privileged background. "How's the new job?" she asked during one of our weekly coffee meetings. We'd returned to the same small cafe where we'd first plotted Marcus's downfall, but now our conversations were lighter, focused on building new lives rather than escaping old ones. "Amazing," I said honestly. "The kids are incredible, and the curriculum actually allows for creativity. I never realized how much I'd been limiting myself. And the dating situation?" I laughed, slow and careful. "Turns out 5 years of manipulation leaves you with some trust issues." "Understandable," Victoria said. "But don't let him steal that from you too. The capacity to love, to trust. That's not naivety, Jessica. That's strength." She was right, though it had taken me months of therapy to begin believing it. Marcus had tried to convince me that my openness, my willingness to trust, my capacity for love, were weaknesses that made me vulnerable to predators like him. But I was learning that those qualities were actually my greatest strengths. They just needed to be protected by better boundaries and stronger self-respect. "What about you?" I asked. "Any romantic prospects for the former Mrs. Blackwood?" Victoria smiled. "Actually, yes. Remember that detective who arrested Marcus, Detective Rodriguez, and I have been corresponding about the case. And, well, let's just say our conversations have become less professional and more personal." "A cop, your parents must be thrilled." "My parents," Victoria said with a grin, "are learning that their daughter has developed some very strong opinions about the kind of person she wants in her life. Wealth and social status have moved way down the priority list." As we sat in that small cafe, watching the early spring afternoon unfold outside the windows, I reflected on how completely my life had changed. 6 months ago, I'd been living a lie, desperately trying to earn love from a man who was incapable of genuine feeling. Now, I was building a life based on my own values, surrounded by people who appreciated me for who I actually was, rather than who I could pretend to be. My phone buzzed with a text from Carmen. "Saw the news about Marcus's sentencing. 15 years, justice served. Drinks tonight to celebrate." I showed the message to Victoria, who raised her coffee cup in a mock toast. "To Marcus Blackwood," she said. "May he spend the next 15 years learning that actions have consequences." "To women who refuse to disappear quietly," I added, clinking my cup against hers. Outside Chicago was coming alive with spring. Trees, budding people emerging from winter's hibernation, everything feeling possible again. I thought about the scared, heartbroken woman who'd discovered those wedding photos just 6 months ago, and I felt a rush of gratitude for her courage. She'd been brave enough to demand answers, strong enough to face the truth, and smart enough to turn pain into power. Marcus had been wrong about so many things, but he'd been especially wrong about one crucial detail. I wasn't the kind of woman who could be discarded without consequences. I was the kind of woman who turned betrayal into justice, manipulation into truth, and heartbreak into a new beginning. And as I walked home through the streets of Chicago, past the building where Marcus was no longer living his perfect lie, I realized that was the best revenge of all. Not just surviving his deception, but thriving because of my own strength. The scared teacher who'd loved unwisely was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her worth and refused to settle for anything less than she deserved. Marcus had thought he was writing my story, but it turned out I'd been the author all along. I just hadn't known it yet.